there is a moth in your house right now that you have been planning to kill. It landed on your wall an hour ago, or it has been circling your kitchen light for the last 10 minutes. Or it is pressed flat against your ceiling in that motionless way moths do when they think no one has noticed them. And your instinct, the one that has been trained into almost everyone by decades of half-remembered warnings about moths eating clothes, and moths being dirty, and moths being something you swat with a rolled-up magazine without a second thought, is telling you to end this quickly. Before you do, I want you to look at it properly for 30 seconds. Because the moth in your house is not what you think it is. It almost certainly is not the species you are picturing. And what happens to it in the next few minutes will tell you something about an entire group of animals that has been catastrophically misunderstood by almost everyone who has ever reached for a rolled-up magazine. Tonight we are going to look at that moth together. We are going to find out what species it actually is, why it ended up in your house in the first place, and why entomologists, the people who have spent their careers studying exactly this group of insects, will tell you that killing a moth indoors is very rarely necessary, and very often a mistake born entirely out of misplaced assumptions. By the end, I think you will understand why the moth on your wall deserves a window and 10 minutes, not a magazine. Let us start with the assumption that is doing almost all of the damage here, the assumption that the moth in your house is going to eat your clothes. This fear is so widespread that it has become almost reflexive, an instinct passed down through households for generations, and it is, for the overwhelming majority of moths you will ever encounter indoors, completely incorrect. There are over 160,000 described species of moth on this planet, and of those, only a small handful. Certain species in the family Tineidae, the case-bearing clothes moth and the webbing clothes moth specifically, have larvae that feed on keratin, the protein found in wool, fur and feathers. These species are small, pale, and rarely fly toward light. They do not circle your lamp. They do not flutter against your window. They hide in dark closets and undisturbed drawers. And the moth doing either of those things is almost certainly not one of them. The moth you are actually looking at, the one circling your kitchen light or resting on your living room wall, is overwhelmingly likely to belong to a completely different group entirely, species that have no interest in your sweaters whatsoever, because their larvae feed on plant material outdoors, on tree leaves, on garden plants, on the kind of vegetation that has nothing to do with anything in your closet. The large yellow underwing, the heart and dart moth, the various species of carpet moth, despite the misleading name, all of these are common nighttime visitors to human homes, and none of them have any biological interest in your clothing at any stage of their life cycle. They are in your house entirely by accident, and understanding why they are there changes everything about what you should do next. So why is the moth in your house at all? This is where the story becomes genuinely interesting. Moths navigate primarily using light, specifically using distant, fixed sources of light like the moon and stars to maintain a straight flight path. For millions of years before electric light existed, this system worked perfectly. A moth flying at night could use the moon, positioned consistently far away and effectively at infinity from the moth's perspective, as a stable reference point, keeping one angle to it constant and flying in a straight line as a result. The system is elegant and ancient and was never designed to encounter a porch light, a kitchen window, or a lamp 20 feet away. When a moth encounters a close artificial light source, the navigation system that worked flawlessly for millions of years breaks completely. Instead of a fixed distant point, the moth is now trying to maintain a constant angle to a light source that changes position relative to its flight path with every wing beat, because the light is close enough that the moth's own movement changes the angle. The result is the spiraling, circling flight pattern you have watched 1,000 times. Without understanding what was happening, the moth is not investigating the light. It is not attracted to it in the sense of wanting to reach it. It is trapped in a navigational error, attempting again and again to correct a heading that the proximity of the light makes impossible to correct. It will continue this pattern indefinitely, expending enormous energy, until the light source is removed, until daylight arrives and overwhelms the artificial light, or until the moth becomes too exhausted to continue. This is the first thing that should change your view of the moth circling your kitchen light. It is not behaving abnormally. It is not behaving aggressively or even purposefully toward you or your home. It is an animal whose navigation system, refined over tens of millions of years, has encountered a phenomenon that did not exist for almost the entire span of its evolutionary history, and it is responding exactly as that system would predict, with confusion that looks from the outside like obsession. Now here is the part that will matter most to you as someone who almost certainly has a garden, a balcony, or even just a single houseplant. Moths are pollinators and not minor or incidental ones. Researchers studying nighttime pollination networks have found that moths visit a comparable number of plant species to bees and contribute meaningfully to the pollination of crops and wild plants that bees and daytime insects either cannot access or visit far less frequently. A study published in the journal Biology Letters found that moths visited flowers at a higher frequency relative to bees in the same habitats during overlapping observation windows, and that moths were responsible for pollinating plant species that received almost no daytime pollinator visits at all. The white and pale flowers in your garden, the ones that seem to do nothing during the day, are very often waiting specifically for moths, releasing their strongest scent after dark in a chemical signal calibrated precisely for moth antennae. If you have a garden, the moth currently circling your kitchen light may be the exact pollinator responsible for fruit and seed production. You will see in a few weeks and will almost certainly never connect back to this moment. Let that settle for a moment. The insect you have been planning to kill because it looked unsettling against your ceiling may be performing on the very night you encountered it, a function that directly benefits a plant you specifically chose to grow. There is something else worth knowing, something that changes how unsettling moths feel once you understand it properly. The reason moths appear so erratic, so larger than they actually are, so capable of startling people in a way that daytime butterflies rarely do, comes down almost entirely to wing scale density and flight muscle ratio. Moths have proportionally larger flight muscles relative to body size than most butterflies, an adaptation that allows for the kind of sustained, energy-intensive flight needed to navigate at night across long distances in search of food and mates. This means a moth's flight, even a relatively small species, can look forceful and unpredictable in ways that feel threatening, despite the animal being almost entirely incapable of causing you any harm whatsoever. The moths most commonly found in homes have no biting mouthparts as adults. Many species cannot bite at all in their adult form, having mouthparts adapted purely for feeding on nectar, if they feed at all once they reach adulthood. The thing your instinct is reading as aggressive is, biologically, an animal trying as hard as it possibly can to escape a situation it does not understand, in a body built for sustained flight rather than precision maneuvering in an enclosed room. So what should you actually do about the moth in your house? The answer is almost always the same regardless of species, and it is considerably simpler than people expect. Turn off the light the moth is circling. In the resulting darkness, open a window or door, ideally one that leads toward an area with less artificial light than the rest of your house. Moths will reliably move toward the darkest available opening once the confusing light source has been removed, because their navigation system can finally function correctly again with nothing nearby distorting it. If the moth has landed and is resting rather than flying, it can usually be encouraged onto a piece of card or gently cupped in two hands, since moths are remarkably robust to brief, gentle handling and released outside without any harm whatsoever. What you should never do is kill a moth simply because it looks unsettling against a wall, or because it has been circling a light for longer than feels comfortable. Not because the moth poses any danger to you. It does not. But because you will very likely be killing one of the small number of nighttime pollinators responsible for plant relationships your daytime garden cannot maintain on its own, ending the life of an animal experiencing a navigational malfunction it has no ability to correct on its own, for no reason beyond a culturally inherited assumption about clothing damage that almost certainly does not apply to the species in front of you. The moth on your wall is not a pest. and it is not a threat. It is a confused traveler. Caught in a light source its ancestors never had to account for, almost certainly doing more good for the plants around your home than you have ever given it credit for. Turn off the light, open the window. Watch it find its way back into the dark, where its navigation finally makes sense again. And the next time someone reaches for a magazine because a moth has startled them, tell them what is actually happening in that moment. Have you ever had a moth in your house and wondered what kind it was or what it was actually doing? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of story this community was built for. And if you want to understand another nighttime visitor, one that ends up indoors just as often as the moth but for a reason almost nobody expects, the next video is already waiting for you.